A courier service van has stopped outside a 4-story building. A young courier named Eric, humming a song, takes a large box out of the van. The courier walks up to the door of an apartment with the number 203 and knocks on the door. "It's the delivery guy," Eric called out, standing at the door with packages in his hands. Someone's sweet female voice behind the door replied, "Coming." The door swung open abruptly, and before the courier stood a surprised young woman who clearly wasn't expecting him. "Doris Lavis?" asked the courier, holding out a package in his hand. Still surprised but excited, the girl replied, "Yes, I'm Doris Lavis." Doris took the package, thanking the courier, politely asking if it was heavy. Eric smiled. Of course it wasn't hard for him. After all, it's only the 2nd floor. And he was used to his job. Already behind the closed door, Doris said, "Well done then," after the courier. After a formal yes, Eric went to the next door, number 202, where the delivery was also to be made. Taking another look at the number, he knocked. Some rough movement and sounds began behind the door. Eric gave out his standby again. "It's the courier." Through the bustling sounds, from behind the door came someone's voice. "Now, just a minute." Someone was obviously in a hurry. In apartment 202, judging by the rumbling outside the door, there was something going on. Eric waited, surprised but patiently, for someone to come out. It was like someone was doing an obstacle course. Bam! There was a sound so loud that the whole place seemed to vibrate. The courier stands there bewildered. Finally it subsided and the door creaked open. Eric stood there with a mute question in his eyes. It was the same girl he had just handed the package to. Only now she was disheveled, and even more surprised than she had been a few minutes ago. "We meet again, Mr. Courier," Doris said in confusion, scratching the back of her head. The courier was taken aback. His eyes widened and he staggered back for a second. Barely regaining consciousness, stammering, he only managed to squeeze out, "Is this apartment 203? Doris smiled awkwardly, saying it was apartment 202. But you're Doris Lavis from apartment 203, aren't you?" the delivery man asked, not understanding at all, completely confused. Doris nonchalantly replied, "Yes, what's wrong?" Eric was confused. The same girl had opened the door of both apartments 203 and 202 for him. What on earth was going on here? Doris, on the other hand, seemed agitated. Without letting the courier come to his senses, Doris, muttering something, quickly found the right box. From the moment the box was in Doris's hands to the time the door lock clicked shut behind her was probably a couple of seconds. Eric didn't have time not only to say a word, but to realize what had happened. He stood there in confusion for a while. The only thing missing was the loading icon above his head. Like in a computer game, Courier Eric was still unable to piece together the puzzle of today's events. He was in shock and clearly wanted to figure out what was going on. But that was it. He should have done it sooner. Once inside the apartment, Doris Lavis breathed a sigh of relief. Mentally, she was pleased with herself. Although this nice girl was neither a wizard nor a superhuman, she had resolved the situation. The package was still in Doris's hands, and there was a slight but obvious resentment in her eyes. The girl was clearly not in her apartment, and this whole circus that had just happened to her needed to be sorted out. From the far room came a calm male voice. It was Eaton Jones, the landlord of this apartment. "Just open it and take it," he said to Doris. The girl boiled up and burst into the room like a powerful tornado, shrieking, "What? What did you say? You asked for help!" Doris flew into the room, barraging Eaton with questions about why he looked so strange and if he had gotten any messages from the courier. Eaton looked like a puzzled jerk. Ridiculously apologizing, he excused himself by saying he'd been watching Wanna One. Doris made a face when asked if she looked like the singer from that band. "Hey, the delivery guy has a lot of work to do. He shouldn't be stressed out about this all the time." Doris was indignant. Eaton twisted as best he could, explaining that he expected this package in a couple weeks at the earliest. But the girl snickered, telling him to pick up his package at a nearby store. "But that's impossible!" Eaton's emotions finally turned on as well. He was excited. What if someone would take his parcel instead of his own, and he was so famous for his beauty? But jumping up, and having already had time to be indignant, upset, and upset at once, the boy noticed a pink box in Doris's hands. Speculation as to the contents of the parcel visited the girl at the same time as irritation. She guessed that the box contained cosmetics and tossed it carelessly, saying, "I don't care." Eaton flew to catch the thrown box. A lucky landing. Not for Eaton, of course, but the box was intact. Doris still decided to finish the guy off with her disgruntled tone. "If you call me out on this nonsense again, you're in trouble." Eaton immediately found something to answer her. "That's it, isn't it? Have you already forgotten our arrangement?" Doris was overcome by a wave of indignation. "I haven't, but it didn't include courier delivery." The verbal altercation was over, but the unresolved situation hung in the air. Both he and she realized that there are no accidents in the world. There is a reason for everything. The silence lasted only seconds. Eaton was the first to break it, offering Doris his help. She didn't object, clarifying that if there was no help, everyone would know his secret. Those words stuck with him. Apparently, everyone has their own skeletons in the closet. Doris managed to suppress the manipulation, and she, exulting, got ready to leave to her room. Eaton sincerely didn't understand what he had done, but he knew he couldn't just let Doris leave like that. He rushed after the girl, clinging desperately to her legs and begging, "Nuna, Nuna, I haven't done anything." Doris tried to free herself indignantly. "Hey, let go. Go to your room. I have a package to open, and you go to work." The girl was already tired from today's events, and Eaton managed to hold her back without much difficulty. He thought of a way to cool her ardor. "The package? Do you have to open it now?" asked Eaton, knowing the answer in advance. Hardly had Doris had time to say, "Yes, absolutely," when he immediately offered to open those parcels together. She was very curious to see what was inside. Finally, the emotions subsided. The packages were opened. Doris and Eaton, sitting directly on the floor, looked at the contents with interest. There is idle and mutual understanding. He asked if Doris would listen to him now. She replied, "Of course I'm listening to you, Appa." Edward resented Doris calling him that, wryly inquiring about the age difference. Doris, in turn, parried that he had asked to be called that. He had no choice but to agree. After unpacking the parcels, Eaton took out a small box and presented it as a gift, chosen especially for Doris. She was genuinely surprised. The girl did not immediately realize what kind of gift she had gotten, but Eaton decided to give her a clue, telling her that this shade would suit her. Doris held out her hands and foolishly asked, "Oh, what's this?" "It's lipstick, silly," replied Eaton laughingly, lovingly tapping her on the forehead with the same lipstick. "We do it for each other, but it's convenient to live next to each other, isn't it?" he asked thankfully, continuing to laugh. "Uh-huh, it's kind of nice," Doris said thoughtfully, rubbing her forehead, and then asked childishly indignantly, "Funny?" It was funny to Ethan. Doris looked embarrassed and confused, and Eaton, noticing this, added in a quietly affectionate voice that his gift would go well with the atmosphere and style she was challenging. They sat looking at each other for a while longer, she blushing, embarrassed, and he pleasuring. Thoughts carried Doris back to the day they met. It was spring. Perhaps that was when she and Eaton's story began. The cherry trees were in bloom, and Doris was walking somewhere along the avenue along which those marvelous trees grew. Some of the petals were falling off, and one such petal landed on the girl's hair. That spring day and that weightless petal were fateful. Someone's hand touched Doris's hair. It was so unexpected that the girl flinched. It was Eaton. He held out a cherry petal to her with the words, "It is said that if a cherry leaf lands on your head, love is sure to come." One event entails a chain of others, and yet this story might not have started. This story began in high school last March. A noisy school environment. Teenagers walking around the school hallway and listening with interest to the loud laughter coming from one classroom. Some were startled by the noises from the classroom. Some, on the contrary, were surprised that the students got along so quickly at the very beginning of the school year. "Ha, God, you're so crazy," came individual cheerful exclamations from that commotion. Someone's voice sounded particularly edgy. "Hey, everyone look at me!" Could it be that she was in this class? Meanwhile, back in the classroom, one student was putting on quite a show. With a mop in each hand and one in her belly, a flighty person named Doris ran around the classroom to the amazement of her peers, shouting, "That's how you mop, Doris style. Beep, beep, step aside." Doris was full of enthusiasm and tried to infect the others with it. "The sooner we finish, the sooner we can prepare for the entrance exams," she said. "But you're not even studying." "What? I study all the time," Doris retorted, and distracted, ran headlong into the handle of a mop which rested on her stomach. Poke. That hurt. Doris said something unintelligible and arched her back. The mop handle beneath her arched in the same way. The students hummed again. Some said they'd known it would happen, some called it funny as hell. Doris herself, slumped on the floor, played like an actress. Posing in the funniest pose she could think of at the time, Doris lay in the middle of the classroom, tragically mocked. Melissa Baker decided to play along, and sitting down next to her, she cried out in a sobbing voice, "Doris, don't die! You promised to buy me bread." The students laughed. Students. The play was gaining momentum. Making a funny face and squeezing out a few tears, Doris whispered that she could see her grandmother. Melissa begged her not to go after that grandmother. The students waited for the denouement of this tragicomedy. And amidst it all, someone was repeating nerdily, "I told you she wasn't learning." The class was loud and boisterous. A lot of people were having fun. Some were playing along, some were muttering indignantly, and Doris, the main actress, was just trying to cheer up her friends. And she succeeded. Doris, Melissa, and Wendy Evans were about to go to the dining room to get the bread Melissa had been asking for. As they were talking, they came to a door that someone was just closing. Boom! And the door banged Doris's forehead with a resounding thud. Ouch! Doris crouched on the floor in surprise and pain. Her friends asked how she was. After making sure the girl was okay, they turned their attention to the door. The guys decided to make a joke and started feeling sorry for the poor door, assessing its damage, and suggesting they call 911. Doris was still sitting there, watching this show in amazement. "Excuse me?" said Doris indignantly, angrily. Someone called her name. Some guy's hand reached for the girl's blazing forehead from the blow. "Are you okay?" he asked her at the same time. It was Caden Adams. The warmth emanating from this guy made Doris's heart flutter. "Your forehead is so red," Caden continued. And Doris looked at him, no longer feeling pain. There was a new feeling in her heart, like a cherry blossom. The boy's sharp voice sobered Doris a little and brought her out of her stupor. She should probably go to the nurse's station. Caden asked if she could stand up or carry her to the infirmary in her arms. Doris, without thinking long, replied, "Yes, can you? Your face is red too." A pink breeze blew into her, focused only on fun, life. It was spring. Spring had passed. So went summer. Fall came. And also winter. The seasons changed one by one. The only thing that remained constant was Caden and Doris's friendship. Doris felt like spring was still in her heart, and the weather in her heart was not affected by the weather outside her window. But on one such spring day in December, after exams, Caden shattered Doris's illusions with his confession. Walking one day, he decided to tell Doris who he liked. This shocked the girl. Blushing, she asked, "What?" Caden mumbled unintelligibly. Doris was demanding, "Say it again! Hurry up!" The boy repeated, "I told you, I like it." Caden sustained a pause that seemed an eternity to Doris. "Your friend Melissa," he finally continued, shattering that spring cherry blossom in Doris's heart with those words. Ba-ba! Cherry blossom explosion. Doris stood there, and from surprise and shock, couldn't say a word. Caden didn't seem to notice Doris's condition. "You're the first person I've told. Will you help me with Melissa?" he asked hopefully. He stared at Doris through the glass of his glasses, and morally finished asking if she'd help him after all. "You're my best friend," Caden added. It was a moral knockout. The cherry tree petals that had been blooming in Doris's soul before this confession had now completely crumbled. Their sad rustling echoed in the girl's devastated soul. After that, Doris realized that it was actually a harsh winter. Schmug, schmug, schmug. "Wow, it's so cold I can't even get tears to flow." Unable to cry fully, the girl sniffled relentlessly, crying snot. The three girlfriends, Doris, Melissa, and Wendy, had gathered at the cafe to discuss the situation. Doris was speechless. Melissa tearfully apologized to her friend, and Wendy comforted her. "Ah, it's hard to love someone you're just a friend." Wendy was her usual self. While she was comforting Melissa, she was urging, no, insisting that Doris get over this guy. What did she see in him? You wouldn't understand, Doris exclaimed. Doris reminded her friends of the story of her and Caden's acquaintance, emphasizing that he was the first person who had been so kind to her, apart from her father. The girls experienced different emotions regarding her words. Wendy, in her toxic manner, tried to cheer Doris up. Anyway, just keep your nose up. I guess you're just not his type. His type? Doris asked in a stupor, sipping from her glass of juice. Wendy continued to pummel Doris, explaining that Caden liked girls who looked like Melissa. But trying to be like her just to be with him was a bad idea. Melissa, listening to her friends' arguments, felt guilty in front of Doris. Wendy reminded the girls of some moments from the past where Doris had behaved, to say the least, emphasizing that Doris should be glad that he considered her at least a friend. Doris wondered. Melissa loved Doris for who she was. How different the girls were. The conversation between the girlfriends was interrupted by a sound that meant their food was ready. Let's eat to cheer up, Doris said mechanically, staring at one point. So the girls decided to go and get their order. Doris clenched her fists and pounded the table with determination. She had made her decision. The girls were just approaching the table when Doris stunned them with her decision. Before uni, I'm going to change beyond recognition, she stated firmly. A mute question froze on Melissa's face. Wendy was equally surprised. Suddenly, Doris jumped up from her seat. The girls, though they knew their friend well, but her sudden outbursts never ceased to shock them. I'm going to be the super mega hottie of the class, Doris, she wailed, with a certain sinister note in her voice. What-o? Was all the girls could reply. Doris's antics did not go unnoticed. Everyone everywhere was discussing her and joking about her. But the girl didn't care. She firmly decided that if she met her soulmate, this would not happen again. Path to the top of the class was the name of Doris's wish list. With 50 days left until Welcome Week, the girl made herself a to-do list that would help her become a national first love. Doris, with faith in herself, clearly understood that to become a beauty, you have to work hard, and she would do it. She was full of enthusiasm. It was so pronounced that even Doris's parents sometimes didn't recognize her. First on the list was to subscribe to beautiful people on social media. That wasn't difficult. Next, Doris bought fashion magazines with cool samples. She needed to learn how to identify current fashion trends. The next step was to follow famous beauty bloggers. Doris was learning how to be a beauty. It's good that nowadays, the internet can be the best assistant in any business. The girl tried to do makeup for the first time, according to the blogger's recommendations. But the reflection in the mirror disappointed her a bit. Something's wrong, isn't it? Doris sighed to herself. The tired girl disappointedly flopped down on the bed. I did everything from the video, but it turned out weird, she said sadly. Doris admired the makeup of the guy who was looking at her from the screen of his phone. Her thoughts were a mixture of amazement and delight. Wow, how could a guy be better than her? The guy on the screen was instructively telling her that makeup alone was not enough for a complete look. Your bow will only be complete when you have your hair done and the right clothes. Doris was skeptical of his words. Hairstyle? Clothes? Really? Is that a problem? Still, she heeded the advice and carried on like a mad woman, loudly demanding her pocket money from her mother. Looks like it's time for an exorcism, her mother sighed doomfully. Doris ran up to her parents and persistently continued to beg for her pocket money. What a flighty girl. Orientation week has arrived. The university welcomes its freshmen. A crowd of students move onto the campus. From all sides, applicants were being called to various clubs and majors to orient and integrate them into the educational environment. Some invited students to the multimedia club, others to something else. The calls were numerous. There was also an impromptu stage on the grounds where guys showed off their hip-hop skills. Nearby, people were invited to check out an acoustic guitar club. Noise, and chatter came from everywhere. There were tons of freshmen scurrying back and forth. Two girls from the student council, Maud Bush and Darcy Faber, stood near the distribution of freshmen to the business management major. Maud couldn't get enough of the young applicants. They reminded her of chickens, cute, inexperienced, and so unsure. Orientation week was the best week yet, for the campus was buzzing with life. Maud Bush and Darcy Faber were delighted with these kids, And happy to note the way they all shined, the women were pleased that no one stood out particularly from the crowd. But they jumped to conclusions. The one who was going to stand out was getting closer and closer to her goal. It was Doris, of course, and she was determined. "You'll do it, Doris." Melissa and Wendy stood nearby with their mouths wide open. Well, everyone's mouths were wide open. Doris didn't just stand out. She made a splash with her appearance. Wow. Doris walked on, mentally proud of herself. She saw it as a good sign that everyone was looking at her like this. Her hard work was apparently not in vain. The girl had managed to draw attention to herself unequivocally. As she continued to collect stares, she was already daydreaming about what more than one guy would surely want to confess to her. Hehehehe. The guys from the student council, Seth and Eaton, didn't ignore Doris either. Seth, actually. He was particularly impressed with her hair. He shared his impressions emotionally with Eaton, even though he wasn't listening to him. Seth was furious and called out to his friend several times, "Eaton! Eaton Jones!" Eaton was undeterred. But at last he couldn't stand his friend's cries, and repeating Seth's tone, calling him a bastard, began to explain that he hadn't slept well. His whole look spoke for itself, but Seth was inexorable. "Stop sleeping, Ethan. Look," he persisted. Ethan's patience broke, and he snapped Seth on the head, promising to stop helping him in the student council if he didn't stop bothering him. Okay, Seth gave up. Meanwhile, Doris approached the student council. "Is this where my story will begin?" she wondered excitedly to herself. "Tootum, tootum, tootum!" Doris's heart began to pound harder and harder, giving in to her temples. Nervously swallowing saliva, she still tried to calm herself down. After consoling herself with the thought that this year she would become head of the business department, her specialty, Doris decided to open the door she was standing near. But just as she grasped the doorknob, pulling it toward her, someone on the other side of the door opened it sharply. Ouch! Getting hit in the forehead by the door, the girl sat on the floor in pain, grabbing her head. "I didn't realize there was someone behind the door. I was too careless. Does it hurt anywhere?" the young man asked confusedly, crouching down beside Doris and groping her forehead. "You ought to go to the infirmary. You hit your forehead so hard. I'm so sorry," Austin Wright coaxed apologetically. That was the name of the man who had an invisible little Cupid perched on his head and was already aiming his love scope at someone. Doris's heart was in the Cupid's crosshairs. You could lose your head that way, in every sense of the word. It's February outside, but Doris could feel the cherry blossoms starting to bloom. In her heart, mint, lilac, or was it jasmine? It was hard to tell which it was, but Austin Wright's perfume was so in tune with spring. In her mind, Doris went back to the moment when Austin had carefully guided her under his arm after that very collision with the door. It seemed as if she could still smell his scent. Doris, lying on her bed with a band-aid on her forehead, dialogued with her friends on the phone, euphorically describing the details of the recent incident. Smiling blissfully and oblivious to the pain, she excitedly recounted how her and Austin's eyes had met, and he had smiled at her instantly. On the other side of the phone, Wendy waited for more details. When she didn't, she asked disappointedly. "What? That's it?" she added with a sneer. "Didn't you say you'd be at the top of your class?" "I thought you two had at least exchanged numbers," Wendy continued, to which Doris replied that she wanted to ask, but he was busy. Melissa was also joined in the conversation. She decided to support her friend by reassuring her that everyone was like that at first, and if they saw him again, they could talk about what happened at orientation. That dialogue could bring them closer together, and then they could exchange numbers. No sooner had Doris rejoiced at Melissa's advice than she stunned her by saying that Doris could seduce Austin and he would become her boyfriend. Wendy, upon hearing this, seemed about to just get off the phone with indignation. "Hey, stop teaching her weird stuff. What do you mean seduce her?" she said indignantly. Melissa hurried to calm her friends down. She offered her friend a super trick. Doris had moved out of her parents' house and was now living alone in a new room, so this reception could be a good fit for her. Doris listened attentively. "It's called, 'Why Don't You Come Over for Ramen?'" Melissa summarized, making Doris interested. Wendy called bullshit on Melissa's idea and tried to tell Doris to think carefully before she used this super trick. Doris listened to both of them in silence and thought to herself, Ramen, I want to try it. Doris's voice came through the phones of both her friends. Her friends immediately fussed, apologizing for mentioning the dish at such a late hour. Wendy added that it might make their faces swell tomorrow and they had class, but Doris said that wasn't what she meant at all. She meant that even ramen would be wonderful if shared with Austin. God, she's so happy just thinking about it. But it's too soon for her. Her girlfriends had given her the advice not to distance herself from him in any way the next time they met, if there was one. Doris was scared. What if she couldn't even say hello to him? Melissa and Wendy tried to encourage and reassure Doris with their advice. She began to drum her arms and legs nervously on the bed. Doris sat in front of the mirror, turning on a video from the makeup guru. She listened to his pleasant, warm voice while admiring him, wondering why his eyes were prettier than hers. She wished she could see his face in its entirety. She repeated everything after the guru, and she had to hurry. The final touch was the lips. They needed to be emphasized. There we go, perfect. Doris jumped out of the apartment and was about to run away to do her business, but she had to wait a little longer. There was a piece of paper taped right on her door. Doris was puzzled. It wasn't just any piece of paper. It was a note left on the door specifically for her. The author of this writing was giving Doris strong advice on how a noisy girl like Doris should properly behave in a house with poor insulation. When Doris had finished reading the whole thing, she saw at the bottom of the sheet a postscript that manners make a man a man. Doris was indignant out loud. What the hell is this? I just moved in yesterday. I was going to do it without your knowledge. What a sissy, she added angrily, tossing the slip of paper with the message right onto the floor. Just as Doris left, the creak of a door opening was heard in the empty hallway. Someone walked over to the crumpled message and stared angrily in the wake of the departing girl. Doris, meanwhile, was hurrying to the university. It was morning, and she had to go to her first class. A bunch of students approaching the building looked around in amazement at someone. It was Doris who was collecting the stares that stuck to her like a magnet. It was not surprising because the bright girl stood out from the gray, moving mass of students, freshmen. She was pacing, staring at her phone. Thinking about where the first class would be held reminded her of orientation day again. How Austin had affectionately touched her forehead then. The girl floated in the pink clouds of memories and paid no attention to the amazed looks. Sometimes it seemed to her that she was going mad, so tormented by those memories that her heart was in love. Her thoughts changed from one to another, changing Doris's mood lightning fast. She was sad. She was happy. Doris wondered if Austin remembered that day, but at the same time she was afraid that he wouldn't even recognize her when he met her. Her musings were interrupted by a voice calling her from behind. It was two people, a guy named Taylor, camera in hand, and a girl named Eleanor. They were asking for Doris's time, introducing themselves as a team of content managers from the university. They were doing a special on dressing up on the first day of school, and they were very interested in the girl. They offered to take Doris's picture. Doris opened her mouth in surprise and amazement. She of course agreed, not believing that this was happening in real life. The girl stood up and thought of poses for the photo. Coming to the auditorium, the girl still couldn't come to her senses. She was happy and proud that her hard work on herself had not been in vain. These thoughts began to give her confidence. Doris decided to write to her friends to share her joyful emotions. But the girls didn't answer. They were probably with their college friends. At the same time, a girl entered the auditorium. She looked for a place to sit, but everywhere was occupied. Doris turned her attention to her. She was sitting alone, so she offered the girl a seat next to her. But she did not want to sit next to Doris, and hesitating, stood next to the desk, where two people were already sitting. This strange girl's name was Alicia. She asked the girls to move a little and sat down third, sharing 2 chairs with them. Doris was stunned. Why? Alicia could have just sat next to her, Doris thought sadly. I wonder if they're from the same school. They're already so close, she pondered sadly. Suddenly someone's voice sounded nearby, asking if the seat next to Doris was occupied. Rejoicing that there was a seat available, Austin sat down next to Doris. The girl almost fell through the ground from such a surprise. She fell into a stupor, and with her mouth wide open in surprise, she couldn't believe her eyes. Austin, as if nothing had happened, calmly began the conversation. The first thing he did was to advise Doris not to be like him. After all, In his first year, he'd been a fool and had dropped out of school. Doris was over the moon that he remembered her name. Oh my goodness, he's so handsome. She couldn't get enough of him. Phew, I ran all the way out here, it's so hot, Austin continued as he took off his coat, drawing the attention of his fellow students. Doris had new plans. The girl, glad of a good opportunity to get close to Austin, finally ventured to speak to him. But her attempt was cut short by the sudden appearance of another student in the audience. It was Ethan. He looked so tired, but he was handsome nonetheless. Who is that? Doris thought. Ethan was already familiar with him, so he was glad to see him coming. You fooled around freshman year, too, Austin joked. Also? Interjected Ethan thoughtfully. Doris was enjoying Austin's warm voice. In the meantime, he continued his dialogue with Ethan, wondering why he looked so tired and suggesting he use some bruise cream. Ethan thought Austin was crazy, resenting the suggestion. But Austin calmly countered that even guys were applying BB cream nowadays. Oh, don't tell me you ran into that again this year? Austin asked sympathetically, suggesting that Ethan come sleep in his room if he wanted to. Ethan, scratching his head, hesitated. Even if he fixed it now, it wasn't likely to get any better. He lowered his gaze, giving him the opportunity to admire his thick and long black lashes. Ethan finally turned his attention to Doris as well. She seemed familiar. He looked questioningly at the girl, wondering where he might have seen her. Their gazes crossed. Ethan's look and tone were not particularly friendly. And you are? Are you on our ward? Huh? He addressed Doris in a somehow cavalier manner. Yes. Why are you asking all of a sudden? Doris was embarrassed by such unexpected abruptness from Ethan Doris. The guys sitting in the auditorium hummed and laughed amicably. One of them was surprised that Ethan, unlike the rest of the guys, did not restrain himself and bluntly said what was on the minds of the majority of those present. Doris was taken aback by this insolence and cavalier attitude and turned indignantly toward the laughing boys. Austin tried to smooth things over by telling everyone that the professor would be here soon. Everyone should have calmed down and sat back down. Austin continued to stick up for Doris, asking Ethan why he suddenly decided to say that. Austin admonished him that it was rude to Doris and asked him to apologize. But Ethan turned away indifferently and, saying he had no use for it, headed back to his seat. Austin couldn't understand what had happened all of a sudden that Ethan had been so harsh with Doris. He called out to his friend again, but he didn't even look in his direction. The boys in the auditorium watched the whole thing in silence. Austin turned to Doris and apologized for him, explaining that Ethan was a sensitive guy. Doris, still reeling from what had happened, simply agreed. And so went Doris's first day. And until the end of today's classes, the girl did not leave the thoughts of today's incident. She returned home in a far less cheerful mood than she had been in the morning. Gloomily wandering past the door to her apartment, she berated herself for this awkward day, and for the way she had silently allowed herself to be offended without being able to say a word. And this on the first day of school. I'll definitely do it next time. Doris's thoughts cut short as soon as she reached her door. A mute question froze in her eyes. On the door in all its glory once again hung someone's note. This time it was glued shut with a whole bunch of duct tape. It was the same note, but on top of it on a yellow piece of paper was added a note. Keep this in mind. Ha! Is this guy crazy, or what? Thought Doris. She had just moved in yesterday after all, and she could take care of herself. Doris walked determinedly to the next door and knocked loudly. Hey! Apartment 202! We need to talk! The girl called in a raised tone, starting to get angrier and angrier. She called out again and again. There was silence on the other side. There's no point, you son of a bitch! Doris was infuriated by all this, and she kicked the door with her foot angrily. The girl, out of control of her emotions, flew into her apartment and threw her bag on the floor and flopped down on the bed. Just seconds later, her fingers were already typing a message in K-Katalk, a popular messenger, that the guy living next door to her was crazy. Doris got emotional and painted the whole thing in vivid colors. Her friends had no time to get into Doris's problems, so they waved off a couple of duty phrases and promised to talk to her later. Doris was upset. How heartless they were after all. In despair, the girl tiredly dropped her head on the pillow. Ah, how depressed she felt now, and also all alone. How frustrating and unpleasant. Everything had been going so well at first. Doris had met Austin. Even the dialogue was starting to take off. It was all that cheeky Ethan's fault, could it be? Her thoughts took Doris back to the situation she had found herself in this morning. How could he, for no reason at all, treat her as if she were some kind of freak? The girl was hurt and angry, at herself, at Ethan, and at all those who had laughed at her today. If only she could turn back time. Then Doris certainly wouldn't have been silent. But Doris wasn't the type of person to be discouraged for long, so to cheer herself up a bit, she decided to watch something on YouTube. Hoping to watch some interesting video, she started flipping through the feed, just in case someone had uploaded something new. Doris tried her best to distract herself by staring at her phone, but the damned thoughts were once again creating images of the morning's situation in her imagination. As luck would have it, there were no new videos either, not today or even from yesterday. She was even about to watch the new channels, but the image of the evil and arrogant Ethan kept popping up in her mind. Remembering him, she felt afraid for some reason. Wasn't that strange? The panic attack was replaced by a sudden burst of vigor. She's not weird. Just silly thoughts for a while, Doris thought. Ha! After all, she'd been photographed for Facebook today. Thinking back on it, Doris felt proud and relieved, perking up. I wonder if the photo has been posted yet. Doris fell back on her pillow with her phone in her hands. Whoa! It's true! Doris's photo was right on the university's Facebook page. She looked so pretty in it. Doris liked the photo, and judging by the number of likes and reposts, she wasn't the only one who liked it. Yeah, she must have just gotten herself all worked up. Well, I'll have to look at the comments. Doris busily tapped at the screen, excited to see something good that would make her feel better. But as soon as she started to read them, a look of deep surprise, even one might say incomprehension, came over her face again. Ha! What the hell? She resented. A deep, starry night stretched its blanket over the town where Doris lived. The windows of her house told her that its occupants were already asleep. At the same time, one could hardly hear anyone's cautious and quiet male footsteps along the corridor of the house. Who could it be at this late hour? The mysterious type, from apartment 202, stopped in surprise right in front of his door. His attention was caught by a note taped just below the license plate. He already knew who had written it. He guessed as soon as he saw the scraps from the note he'd written to Doris on the floor by the door. You must be very sensitive. Mind your own business, was the text written on that piece of paper. It was the first time the man in front of the door had read such words about himself. Doris was sitting in her room with the phone in her hands. She was flipping through the comments under her Facebook photo with a kind of horror. It felt like it was full of haters. In the comments, she was discussed, condemned, and mocked. Both clothes and makeup, and even Doris's face got under the crush. Even that situation in the audience was discussed. The more Doris read, the more she wondered, and she didn't want to believe they were discussing her. How could it be? She subscribed to all the YouTube tutorials. That can't be true. Doris's shock grew in progression, and the phone seemed to grow attached to her hands. The girl kept tapping the phone screen, thinking that if the commenters were writing all this in complete seriousness, then it meant that all beauty bloggers were weird. But that doesn't make any sense at all, does it? Doris was more inclined to believe that she was a victim of cyberbullying. Yeah, that's a big problem these days. Doris's search for cause and effect was interrupted by an unexpected phone call. It sounded so sudden to her that she almost threw her phone away. No sooner had Doris said hello than someone's wild shout of a high-pitched scream echoed on the other side of the phone. Hey, dumbass! What were you thinking? Poor Doris didn't know what she was thinking anymore lately. It was Wendy calling. Judging from the background noise, she was on the subway. She already knew all the news about Doris, and she was calling to tell her off. She was getting emotional, yelling that she should have stopped her back then, at that coffee shop. And Doris couldn't believe it. Could it really be that bad? The girl sat dejectedly listening to Wendy's voice. You really didn't know? No one told you? Doris had nothing to reply to this. The realization of the whole situation was only now beginning to fully come to her. This. So it wasn't her imagination. The puzzle of the whole absurd situation was finally being put together in Doris's mind. In flashes of memory, taunts and snide glances swirled through her mind. And not so long ago, she had been so proud of herself. Ah! Throwing the phone on the bed, Doris cried, her head in her lap. So many problems, and it was all on her head. The girl began to beat herself up. She had never felt so humiliated before. What she had been doing all this time, for what and why. Now it was incomprehensible to her. Imagining what an idiot she looked like in front of others, and how amusing she was in her ridiculousness, Doris cried out desperately, "Ah, what am I supposed to do now?" It seemed as if every living thing around her could hear those cries. When she arrived at the university the next morning, Doris wished she could have fallen to the ground rather than see and hear the laughter from everywhere. But merciless gossip came from every corner. I thought my stomach was going to burst from laughing. Isn't that super funny? These and many other such phrases hurt Doris's heart. Doris today was nothing like she had been yesterday. In a dark, discreet jacket, cap, and hood, she walked past the clamoring crowd, listening to the hurtful gossip about the strange girl Doris. It seemed that everyone was talking about her without exception. Doris had already regretted coming here again many times. What if someone recognized her? She was scared. As she walked down the corridor, she suddenly saw the same person. Etona! Oh my God! Yes, it was him. He was carrying a loudspeaker with a confident stride, and his friend Seth from the student council was walking beside him. Doris turned back to the wall, pretending to look at something. The guys walked by without even paying attention to her, talking about their own things. The seconds that Doris stood with her back to the wall seemed like an eternity. She mentally prayed that they would just walk by and not notice her. Doris was literally shaking with fear, but this time it was all right. Ethan said to Doris, "Nice hoodie." And they walked on without stopping, but the unhappy girl wanted to go home. The rest of the school day passed without adventure. Listening to the last lecture, Doris wished it would end as soon as possible. When the professor finished reading the material, the girl was relieved. Finally, Doris began to pack, deciding that she had to get out of here as soon as possible. As students were supposed to do after class, everyone was buzzing and talking, going home. No matter how Doris hid behind the hood of her hoodie, she couldn't go completely unnoticed. Suddenly, someone turned to her. "Have you seen our uni page? A girl from our department was there." Tudum. Doris's heart seemed to just stop in that second. "I'm not sitting there," the girl objected, clearly realizing what was being said about her. The boy became more insistent. "Shall I show you? The page is called Fashionistas, or something like that." He kept up with Doris. "Hurry up and go home," the inner voice whispered to the girl. She jumped up from her desk, going to leave quickly, but in her way stood like a wall the boy who had just spoken to her. It was Conan Addington, the one who had been taunting her along with Eaton. A second later, Doris's cap was already on the floor. "Doris?" Conan darted his eyes in surprise at the frightened and confused girl. She looked up at him, and images from that ill-fated day came back to mind. Yes, he had laughed at her too. Doris remembered it well. "Wow! You look different than usual, huh? I didn't even recognize you." Conan was surprised. "Can you move out of the way?" Doris decided to just ignore the guy's outbursts. She was about to leave when Conan grabbed her arm. "Hey, wait a second," he kept saying. Wow, he was persistent. "I saw you on Facebook," Conan said, still not letting go of her. Doris resented his behavior. She was creeped out by the whole thing. The students who had witnessed the scene murmured in the background without intervening. Conan noted with a sneer that of all the posts in their department, the one with Doris's picture had gotten the most reactions. The girl had had enough of his tactlessness, and she cried out, "Let go!" Conan, ignoring Doris's outcry, continued, "Honestly, I wanted to tell you that you were dressing funny, but we just met, so I thought I'd let it go." "What?" She was taken aback. "I felt sorry for you after I read the comments yesterday," he added condescendingly. "Hey, but at least you found out, right?" The annoying guy couldn't shut up. Doris wondered for a moment why she was listening to him in the first place. "Hey, do you want to go to the internet cafe? I want to hang out with you." Whether the fellow student was seriously suggesting or mocking. "Hey, let go." Doris couldn't get her hand out of his clinging grip. Conan persisted and began urging Doris not to act like this. He argued that this was her chance to socialize with people and make friends. Doris asked for the umpteenth time to let her go, but when, even after that, he started to say something, the girl's patience broke. Screaming, "Let go!" She finally wrenched her hand out of Kanan's tenacious grasp and punched him right in the face. Snap! It seemed to be the nose. Doris, quickly pulling her hood up, ran away. She was followed by Kanan cursing and demanding that Doris stop. He was standing there somewhere under the lecture hall, bent over. She could still hear someone saying his nose was bleeding, but Doris didn't care anymore. It was quite dark by the time the girl got home. Ah, how tired she was, poor thing. "Why the hell do I have to go so far?" thought Doris, leaning against a street pole. "Am I really going to be tortured all the way to graduation?" She continued to reason, getting depressed just thinking about it. Finally, Doris saw a supermarket. "Oh, maybe I should get something spicy," she thought as she walked closer. But she had no luck here either. The shelf with the item she wanted was empty. Really? What's with the black streak? Doris paced between the racks of the supermarket, no longer having any definite goal in mind. But suddenly her gaze fell on the beer fridge. What if? Why not? Doris made up her mind. Yes, that's right, she's an adult, so she can already relax with something more refreshing, right? Her hand resolutely reached for the tin can of beer. Suddenly, at the same second, someone else's hand collided with her hand. Ouch. That was as unexpected as possible. Doris apologized and politely conceded, "Oh, sorry, come in." Doris? Wondered the man who had been yielded to. The girl's eyes widened with equal surprise. "Austin!" Doris shrieked. The last thing she had expected to encounter here was him. "It's good to see you," Austin said, smiling sincerely. With a quick movement, Doris pulled the hood of her hoodie up, hiding herself from Austin's gaze. She wanted to appear mature, but sometimes she just acted like a little girl. Austin stared at it, not sure what was wrong. "What's wrong, Doris?" he inquired. "Nothing. Take the first." The girl felt so uncomfortable with the recent events of her life. She was most afraid that Austin would laugh at her, too. "What do you mean, nothing? Does something seem wrong to me?" Austin continued to question the frightened Doris hiding inside the hood. Of course she wasn't okay, and the guy needed to find out what was wrong. With a mute question in his eyes, Austin looked at the girl. She was strange, but there was something about her that clung. Doris replied that he was just imagining things, and she was fine. At the same time, though, she thought, if only he hadn't seen anything, or at least pretended not to know anything. Okay. Austin decided to change the subject so the girl would be a little distracted and relaxed. Doris, did you want to buy a beer?" he asked thoughtfully, immediately adding, "Huh? Maybe. Would you like to have a drink together?" "We could." "Wait, what?" Doris was taken aback. Before she knew it, she was at the same table with Austin. Beer was on the table. Trusting, in a friendly conversation, Doris explained the situation to Austin. As it turned out, he really wasn't aware of the recent events of the uni, so that was it. The girl's story made him think. Doris didn't really like the beer, and though she drank it without showing it, she noted to herself that it was bitter. She'd rather have a cocktail. She wanted to know what Austin thought of her, so she asked, "Do I seem strange to you?" "I think you're unusual, but freshman year everyone is, so it doesn't bother me," he replied. The beer had put a little hop in Doris's head, and she decided to talk it out. She sighed desperately and shared her worries with Austin, and there was a lot to worry about. Not only had she failed to become popular in her department, but she had also disgraced herself. How was she supposed to go to class? After all, rumors about her must have spread everywhere by now. Even today, when Doris was at the university, she wanted to disappear. After all, it seemed that everyone around her was talking only about her, as if there were no other topics. The girl continued to pour out her soul, telling how she couldn't stop shaking when she heard people discussing her right in front of her nose. Oh, how much she was going through, and she just needed support. On top of that, she couldn't say anything to the guy who was hurting her. Everything Doris was going through, Austin knew now. "Keep going there," Doris began. "Must be hard," Austin finished. "The only thing I can say now is don't let it affect you. Don't worry about it. It will subside after a while," he advised. Doris was a little cheered by his words, and she looked at him with great gratitude. Her eyes glistened, either from happiness or from the beer she had drunk. "So hang in there," Austin summarized his advice. "Yes," Doris thanked affirmatively. It was a good thing she'd decided to stop by here today. Sometimes the right people show up in life at the right time and find such the right words. Austin wondered if his advice was too general. Doris replied that she felt much better after talking to him and his advice. He, in turn, suggested that she contact him if she had any problems, and even if he couldn't help, he would at least listen, like today. Doris's cheeks flushed. She finished her beer. She admired Austin, marveling at his qualities. He's so attentive. His every word sounds so caring. How someone like him could exist in this world. Austin glanced at his watch. It was already too late. It's always hard to notice how fast time is running away behind the conversations. Doris was so reluctant to leave him now. If only time would stop right now. But Austin was clearly watching the time. "Doris, it's getting late. Should we go?" The girl used the slightest excuse to linger with him here at least a little longer. "Wait, I haven't finished my drink," she said. And despite Austin's words that she didn't have to finish it, she did. After all, he had bought it for her. The beer was finally finished, but as Doris stood up, she felt her legs failing her. She wanted to walk, but she couldn't because she was wobbling like an autumn leaf in the wind. In the house where Doris lived, a man was having a sleepless night. He was standing on the landing, right by the window facing the street. He had his cell phone in his hand and anxiety in his heart. From the window, he saw the silhouette of a guy carrying a girl on his shoulders. He knew who it was they were carrying. It was probably them he was looking out the window. From afar, their conversations were clearly audible. Soon they would be upstairs. And so Doris found herself in her apartment. But while Austin had carried her, she had taken a little nap. And now she was sitting against the wall, and her eyes did not want to open. When the girl did open her eyes, she didn't immediately realize where she was. "I'm home," she stretched out tiredly. Austin was standing in the kitchen, leaning against the refrigerator laughing. Doris seemed amused. She should have been more careful with alcohol. "How did I get here?" wondered Doris. "You'll remember later," Austin replied with a laugh. He was familiar with this condition, so he didn't leave her behind and got her home safely. Mission accomplished, and it was time for him to go. "I'll be going then," Austin said determinedly. Doris looked questioningly straight into his eyes. The beer had slowed her train of thought. Seeing the confusion in the girl's gaze, Austin added, "Take care of that hangover, okay? I'll see you around." He said, "Take care of the hangover." His words worked like a switch for Doris's thoughts. She remembered her friend Melissa's advice, and her friend's words echoed in her head. "The reception is called, 'Why don't you come over to my place for ramen?'" Yes, of course, when better than now, she should do it right now. These thoughts revived Doris. "Please wait a minute," she said. Austin, looking surprised, turned to her questioningly. Doris got up from the floor, and still a little wobbly walked over to the guy, who was already standing at the door, about to leave. "I'll make you some ramen," she ventured to offer. "Please stay for the ramen," Doris repeated again. Austin stood in bewilderment. Such a suggestion from a tipsy girl took him by surprise. What are you talking about? Doris, you're very drunk. Let's just—" He didn't have time to finish. At that time, in the next apartment, someone clearly heard every word of their dialogue. The occupant of apartment 202 was not going to eavesdrop, so he plugged in the speakers and maximized the sound. He was pleased with himself. One thing that wasn't clear was why he was doing this. "Austin, you're not leaving so easily, are you?" Doris reached out, clinging to the guy's coat. The sounds of the speakers from the neighboring apartment sounded to Doris at that moment like a yacht humming, departing from its mooring, and the whole scene looked as if Doris didn't want to let her lover go on a long voyage. Ha. They stood like that for a while. Doris didn't want to let Austin go. He stood there not knowing what was going on. Doris was already weird, and she was even weirder when she was drunk. The sounds in the background added to the comedy of the situation. It was as if the yacht were sailing away from the shore to the sound of waves and seagulls, and they were standing on the shore, unable to say goodbye. At least Doris imagined it. "It sounds like a harbor," suggested the girl, listening to the creaks and rumblings coming inexplicably from somewhere else. "Does it sound like the sound is coming from the neighbors?" also suggested Austin. "Neighbors?" echoed Doris, looking at the wall that separated her apartment from the one next door. Yes, the sounds seemed to be coming from there. "Doris, I think I should get going. Let's eat ramen next time. See ya," Austin quickly rambled on. Doris didn't even have time to say wait before the door slammed shut behind her. Doris dejectedly wandered across the apartment to the squeaks and creaks and the whole spectrum of sounds that could be heard from behind the wall. "Hey!" Someone sighed so loudly that Doris thought it was done right behind her back. Jerking nervously, she sobered instantly.
For a while the girl stood motionless, listening to all those chaotic sounds. What on earth was it? In addition to the sounds, loud laughter could be heard.
Doris listened. By now she could clearly hear her neighbor's every word. She read my "please keep this in mind" message. The girl tensed and moved even closer to the wall as she continued to listen. The neighbor continued to complain to someone. "It clearly says, 'Don't bring your other half here. Let her stay outside.' So why didn't she listen? Isn't that basic manners when we're in apartments that aren't soundproof?" Doris twitched her hand nervously. She was starting to get angry. Even if she has no manners, she should at least get the hint. "How am I going to spend a whole year with someone like her?" he persisted. Doris couldn't stand it. "Hey, I can hear you," she said it, not expecting to get a response. But he answered, "Oh, did you hear everything?" which sounded quite ironic. Doris sat down. "What am I to do? You see, I said it on purpose so you could hear," he added angrily, but with a sneer. Doris exploded. "You think? I don't know that, you bastard!" she yelled, pounding him angrily into the wall. The girl was furious. "Jesus, you scared me!" Doris's pounding on the wall was unexpected by her neighbor. "Is that fool hitting the wall now?" he thought, jerked by those sharp sounds. "I was so loud you did that? I was?" The girl was indignant. He excused himself. "If you hadn't been so aggressive when I asked you politely the first time, I wouldn't have done it." Doris was taken aback. "Politely? You call that polite? Writing a note like that on the first day is polite?" "Maybe you didn't think it was polite because your personality is screwed up," the neighbor parried. Their argument woke up the rest of the neighbors. The banging on the wall and yelling in the middle of the night had roused many of the residents of their building. Already outraged screams were coming from other apartments. Someone asked them to shut up. Someone politely asked them to be quiet. Someone swore at the banging on the wall in the middle of the night. Oh, it had been a stormy night. Despite the indignation of the awakened neighbors, Doris continued to bang on the wall and yell. In the midst of her desperate cries, she didn't even notice the cracks that began to form at the top of the wall, slowly but surely sliding away with each of her blows. Doris had to go through many trials that day, all because of her foolish goal. Maybe it was because Doris was drunk, but she was very angry, and with her legs already in motion, she kicked the poor wall with all her might. "I'd just get on with my life at uni and at home, even if you hadn't done all this," she said. Doris was angry and upset at the same time. Who knew what was going through her mind? Except she couldn't tell anyone about it because it was her own fault. All I wanted was for the person I like to look at me, but people call me a weirdo," Doris said with tears in her eyes and a shaky voice. "Why can't people leave me alone?" At this phrase, the girl slammed into the wall with all the force she could fit in fragile Doris. A very strange sound was heard. The wall that Doris had been hitting so hard began to crack, separating from the ceiling. The sound was growing and rapid. Something irreversible is about to happen, were probably the thoughts of both of them at that moment. Yes, that's exactly what happened. With a creaking and cracking sound, the wall fell down with a terrible rumble. It was unbelievable that a girl could have the strength to do such a thing. There was silence and stillness for a while. Doris stood in a stupor. Her neighbor was even more stunned and shocked as he bounced from the falling wall and barely managed to dodge it, and so began their magnificent story. "Eaten?" Doris froze in surprise. Her fate must have had an excellent sense of humor, except Doris wasn't amused at all. What a meeting. So it was worth going back to the very moment when the wall had crumbled between the two. It had been only 2 days since Doris had moved into the new apartment, and already such a disaster had happened. The girl was puzzled. At a loss, she couldn't figure out what to do now. It was hard to believe that the wall had broken. Wait a minute, though. What was more important right now? It was that the man in room 202 was none other than Ethan himself. Was it really him? I couldn't believe it. Doris came to her senses and ran to the boy, asking him if he was all right. But as soon as she stepped onto his property, the guy jumped up and yelled, "Stop! Don't come in!" Doris froze in place with her mouth hanging open in mute question. Seeing the fright in the girl's eyes, he immediately tried to remedy the situation. "I mean, it's dangerous, so don't come in." Doris still had fear in her eyes, but there was some truth in her neighbor's words. It really was dangerous. "It's dangerous, so get out," Ethan repeated again. "What? What about the wall? What about you?" Doris needed specifics. "I'll take care of it, so go somewhere else for a while," he reassured the girl. Doris wondered. I wonder what had gotten into him. Listening to Ethan, Doris's gaze happened to fall on the furnishings in the room behind the guy. Her eyes rounded. "Ooh, what is it?" Ethan's room was furnished in such a way that one wouldn't have recognized it as a guy's room. To the left of the wall was a dressing table with a lot of makeup and makeup stuff on it. Just above it was a large mirror with lights. A little farther away, in the kitchen, you could see 2 wigs standing on stands on the refrigerator. It was beautiful. The room was every girl's dream, but the fact that it was a guy's room was odd to say the least. "What is this? Is this your room, Ethan?" The guy stammered, not knowing what to answer Doris, and simply blocked the way to his room with his hands, not allowing her to go any further. The longer Doris looked at that room, the makeup, the dolls, the wigs, the more guesses came into her head. Ethan didn't know how to justify himself. For him, this whole situation was also unexpected, and he said, gathering his thoughts, "I'll explain everything, so don't jump to conclusions." Doris tactfully reassured him by saying, "I respect your tastes." For some reason in her imagination, she now saw Ethan dressed as a girl. Doris interrupted Ethan, asking if they should talk about the wall first. But the boy was determined and asked to be allowed to explain everything to her first. The tenants of the building again activated cries of outrage, no longer able to stand all the fuss these two had made in the middle of the night. There was an insistent knocking on the doors of apartments 202 and 203. "Come out now," they shouted behind the door. "Wow, I think our neighbors are here." Doris was startled. Ethan dashed off somewhere with the speed of a doe. What on earth was he doing? Doris looked curiously at her neighbor. Apologies came from the hallway, and the voices of disgruntled neighbors. This noisy night seemed never to end. Doris stood in the middle of the hallway in front of a whole crowd of indignant tenants. After listening to her excuses, they peppered her with questions. What room was she from? Why was she here alone? And where was room 203? Doris flapped her eyelashes in confusion, wondering which question she should answer first. Doris hesitated. Minutes earlier, she was still in the midst of things. Hearing the neighbors knocking, Ethan had asked Doris to go out to them alone. The grown boy who had climbed under the table looked scared. But what was he so afraid of? Doris clarified if he was going to come out too. Ethan didn't even think about coming out. The girl didn't understand what could be the reason for Ethan's strange behavior. He explained that he didn't want people to know that he was from room 202. The boy begged Doris to keep his identity a secret. And not so long ago, he behaved very differently with her. How dramatically things can change in an instant. Of course, Doris felt sympathy for the guy and went out to the neighbors alone. Standing in front of an angry crowd demanding explanations, the girl thought she was going to lose her mind. Gathering her strength, she answered them that she did not know why the tenant 202 room does not go out. And then the neighbors began to blame Doris for what had happened. The girl was guiltily silent. She had nothing to say. They were half right. Somewhere in the crowd, some of the tenants resented the fact that in their house the rooms were divided into studios. That was a real problem for most. Doris took note of these words. Then they began to admonish her. Perhaps because you've recently moved in, you don't know that you can't act the way you used to. We hear everything. Didn't you know that? That's why we have low rent. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Doris excused herself as best she could. She was asked to be more careful from now on. I wonder what they meant by dividing the rooms. With these thoughts, Doris, who had finally been separated from that crowd, tapped on the fallen wall. So that's what Eaton meant then, leaving a note on her door. Mada, how awkward this had gotten. Doris stood there confused. If she hadn't been so harsh and hot-tempered, this might not have happened. But oh well, as it was. "What are you doing?" Doris turned her attention to Eaton, who was putting something into boxes. "I'm cleaning the room before the master comes. They're bound to come if we tell them the wall is broken. They should see the whole thing," the guy replied, not looking away. Eaton dialed the landlord's number, but the answering machine voice informed the guys that the caller they were trying to reach was not registered in a roaming foreign country. That is, he was currently unavailable. What? Eaton and Doris looked at each other fearfully, not believing their ears. What were they supposed to do now? A foreign country? Doris exclaimed, shocked. Eaton said that his status at Cacao Talk said he was on a trip. It was unlikely that he would be back here for the rest of the semester. That was so-so news. Doris checked to see if he had an emergency contact. Ethan, after searching, replied that it didn't say anything about that. They sat in a kind of stupor, not knowing what to do. Neither Ethan nor Doris had ever had anything like this happen to them before. The girl asked in horror if they would have to wait for him to come back, explaining that as long as they were around, they would be in constant conflict. "No way, I don't want to," Doris resented desperately. Ethan didn't want to share the living space with her either. "I don't want to either, okay? But it looks like we have to. We have no other choice." Doris picked up the phone and started to open the phone book and said, "Then we should tell my parents. Maybe they'll know what to do." "What?" squealed Eaton indignantly. He grabbed her phone lightning fast, trying to wrestle it from her hands. Doris, trying not to let go of her phone, yelled, "What are you doing? Let go!" Eaton was very frightened, and without releasing his grip said that if her mother saw all this, she would definitely sue him. He pleaded with her not to make things worse. The two men's confrontation over the phone continued. Eaton was pulling him to his side, yelling that if things got worse, his hobby might be exposed, and he couldn't let his family and acquaintances find out. Just then Doris exploded. "Are you serious? Why should I care about your situation? Not only did you embarrass me in front of everyone on the first day of class, but you made a ruckus behind the wall. That doesn't mean I'm better, but I've been polite up until now, and you're acting like a total jerk. I don't want to stay with someone like you." Doris finally told this guy everything she'd been feeling about him lately. She finished him off by calling him a transvestite and a pervert. Eaton sat in a stupor. He probably deserved the way Doris treated him, but she didn't know him. Eaton loosened his grip, apologizing, and Doris took the phone and stared at him angrily. He lowered his gaze guiltily, saying he understood why Doris hated him so much, and he knew she hated the fact that she had to stay with him for the time being. The guy asked to be given some time to find a way to cover things up. The girl listened to this, not long ago cocky, but now desperate guy. He seriously thought he would go crazy if he heard people calling him a pervert. A sprout of pity for him began to creep into Doris's heart. "Please, I'm begging you," Eaton pleaded. Doris was no longer angry with him. She didn't know how she was able to bounce back and forgive offenses so quickly. She sat with her phone in her hands, torturing herself with thoughts of what to do and how to act. She felt sorry for him. She understood how he was feeling right now. But looking into his room through the opening that had been created by the falling wall, she truly didn't understand how they could live together. And if they didn't find a solution, they would have to live together until the landlord returned. Doris's thoughts were suddenly cut short. Something very interesting and meaningful caught her attention in Eaton's room. Surprised and at the same time delighted, she exclaimed, "Vi! What is it?" And jumping up from her seat, whirled past the perplexed boy. Ethan was still anxious and upset. He didn't understand what Doris had seen that surprised her so much. He called out to the girl, trying to stop her, but Doris was already standing right in his room, looking at the award hanging on the wall. Her exclamation was full of delight. "Is that a silver button? Wow, I've never seen one of those before." Indeed, not every neighbor in the house has a YouTube award to see. The girl couldn't take her eyes off that button. "Wow, cool. I watch a lot of YouTube. What's the name of your channel? Maybe I know it?" Already forgetting about today's situation, Doris chirped cheerfully. Ethan was at the wall, and standing right in front of Doris, obscured the award and the table with the computer, shouting fearfully, "No, not that!" "A tune," Doris stretched out questioningly. Immediately a hunch, like lightning, abruptly entered her thoughts. "Erlis?" asked Doris out of breath. Yes, of course it was him. After all, it was his beauty reviews that Doris had been watching. There was a reason his face and eyes looked so familiar. Doris felt ashamed and apologized for calling him a pervert. Now she could see why he wore so much makeup. The girl began to excitedly tell him that she always watches his videos and shares them with her friends, calling herself a big fan of Erlis. Eaton became embarrassed and asked her to stop calling him Erlis. Doris couldn't calm down. Emotions swept over her, and she excitedly told him that when she was getting ready for the first day of class, she had watched his videos. Eaton shook his hands convulsively. It was clear he was nervous. "I'm keeping this a secret, so please don't go around," and the guy didn't get a chance to finish before Doris took his hand in hers, reassuringly. "Eaton, I'll wait until the master comes back." "So help me, please," she begged, still not releasing his hand from hers. "I need your help," Doris repeated, asking Eaton to work together until master returned. Eaton didn't understand what working together meant. What did she mean by that? He waited apprehensively to see what Doris would say next. Another school day came. In the corridor of the university, 3 guys standing at the drinks machine were discussing Doris. Conan was among them, the same guy Doris had punched in the face last time. The guys were discussing that situation, laughing that Conan had been beaten up by a girl. Conan was angry. The guys continued to make fun of their friend. Conan stepped away from them angrily and told them that she would get hers. Oh, how much more poor Doris was going to get. Surely this angry type was determined to get back at her. Conan suddenly heard a lively buzz among the boys down the hall. He turned to see who they were all there discussing. "You think? She looked completely different, didn't she?" someone in the crowd was saying. The students were walking and bantering, but for now it was unclear who was the object of their scrutiny. Business Administration Department. Notice of general meeting for the new semester. Date, March 9th. Venue, Babam Pub. The notice was posted on a board outside the student council. The members of the student council were discussing the upcoming event, standing in front of the notice. Maud Bush noted that this was their chapter's first meeting of the semester. Darcy reported that they also sent out a text message and told all freshmen that attendance was mandatory. So even if others don't show up, there should at least be freshmen. Meanwhile, Austin and Seth were walking down the hallway to the student council. Seth enthusiastically called Austin handsome. Austin took it as a taunt and grudgingly pulled him back. But Seth continued to praise Austin, describing how famous he was among the freshmen. "They all think the president of our department is super mega handsome," Seth said, smiling flatteringly. Austin asked him to stop, to which Seth objected to Austin being too modest. A pair of slender legs in heeled shoes stopped not far from the people gathered at the announcement near the student council. From afar, someone's phrases were heard from afar. "There are also rumors that Freshman of the Year is a load of crap for you." "What do you mean by Freshman of the Year?" Those standing outside the student council turned on cue at the sound of her heels. "Ooh! Ah!" A look of mute surprise froze on the faces of those present. It was Doris. She was simply unrecognizable. She looked unusual, but she was so cute that you wanted to look at her again and again. Her hair neatly coiffed, her stylish clothes and makeup emphasized, and made Doris stand out from the crowd. Austin was at a loss for words. Even the girl's face seemed to have changed completely. Her eyes stood out and were so deep that one could drown in them. Delicate lips were emphasized by a faint gloss. Flower-shaped earrings added spring lightness to her image. She was beautiful. She looked that way tonight, thanks to the very night she'd knocked out the wall to Eaton's room. Doris had agreed then to stay with him until her master returned, if Eaton would help her. The help she had asked for then was for Eaton to teach her how to dress properly. She was so eager to achieve her goal of dating Austin, and Eaton, of all people, could help her achieve that goal. That night, Doris and Eaton formed a new alliance, an alliance of support and companionship. Doris would restart her spring with a fresh start. The look in Austin's eyes, who stood now, fascinated by her, was the best proof of that. He who has a purpose is not daunted by obstacles. and for the sake of that deep, tender gaze, Doris was willing to try. All those who were standing around the student council were also surprised by such a dramatic change in Doris's appearance. She definitely knew how to draw attention to herself. Only the ways were different. But after all, only those who do nothing are wrong. At the end of the corridor, 3 girls were watching the scene. They also couldn't believe it was Doris. Lively discussing the details of her appearance, they came to the conclusion that Doris looked really cute. Just wow. However, what bothered them was the fact that she was with Austin. One of the girls grinned wryly, saying, "Even if she is cute, she's still the same Doris, right?" Her words sounded mysterious. "Just who are you, dark-haired beauty?" Eaton drank his coffee as he sat in the university hallway and remembered everything that had happened between him and Doris back then. He looked thoughtful and focused, not paying attention to anyone around him. The words Doris had said to him then echoed in his mind. "I want to date Austin. Please teach me how to dress properly." He then asked her to explain what she meant, and the girl expressed her desire to learn to dress in a style that Austin liked so that he would fall head over heels in love with her. Ethan didn't understand the problem. One could find something normal and dress up a little. Did she really need his help to do that? But as it turned out, she did, because that was the reason Doris was in this position. Doris no longer believed in her own strength, and there was nothing else she could try. It seemed to her that changing wasn't such a bad idea, so she trusted him, relying on the fact that his skills would be very useful in creating a new Doris. The girl promised not to blame Eaton if it didn't work out. He, on the other hand, was tormented by doubts. But after thinking and weighing the pros and cons, Eaton agreed to help Doris. But it would only be until the landlord arrived. In the meantime, he asked the girl to keep his secret. In Eaton's mind, who was now sitting and drinking coffee, scraps of memories from that night flashed through his mind. All these thoughts made him so tired that he had a headache. Why had he made that promise? O was beginning to regret it. The guy berated himself for getting carried away with her, saying that she would wait until the landlord arrived. Idiot! Where did I get the confidence to say something like that? He thought in frustration, slapping himself on the forehead. Preparing an image for Doris, Eaton was in shock. He had hoped to pick something more or less normal from the things in her closet, but there weren't even the basics. When it came to hair, Eaton discovered Doris didn't take much care of her curls. The makeup was all wrong too. Now Eaton sat tensely, and remembering the whole process of creating the look, thought, if only everything had gone well. Back again to the meeting between the new Doris and Austin. "Did you get home safely last night?" she asked him. "I feel good, thanks to your advice yesterday," Doris continued. The guys from the student council were standing nearby and listening breathlessly to every word so they wouldn't miss anything and would be the first to be informed. Doris smiled sweetly and decided to ask, "Do you think I've changed much since yesterday?" Austin stood as if frozen, and Doris, expecting some reaction from him, did not understand why he was silent. But Austin's words literally shocked the girl. "Let me know if you want to talk again. All I can do is listen. Don't try to handle this alone, much less with alcohol." Yikes. Anything she'd expected words, but definitely not those. "You can't drink." He clapped her on the shoulder with those words. A mute question lingered in Doris's eyes. She didn't understand why he hadn't reacted in any way to her change. Had all her efforts been in vain? Austin quickly turned his attention back to those he had been standing with before Doris appeared. "Maud, you said you didn't have your next date, did you?" he asked the short-haired girl. "Yes," Maud replied. Doris stood confused and did not understand what was the matter. He seemed to be looking for an excuse to talk to anyone, just so long as there was an excuse to get away from Doris. The awkwardness in his demeanor was evident. Something happened yesterday. Something Doris didn't remember, but it could be the reason Austin was acting so strangely today. Misty fragments of last night swirled in her memory, but there was nothing for Doris to latch onto. "Come on, Doris, think. That, Eaton," thought the girl, and raced down the hallway straight to where he was sitting pensively sipping coffee. "Ethan!" shouted Doris, running up to the uncomprehending fellow. He thought there would be no more peace of mind with this girl in his life. Out of breath, she asked the dazed Eaton if something had happened yesterday. What a crazy woman, the boy thought as he shuddered at her sudden appearance. His heart nearly jumped out at the surprise. Frantically going over the events of yesterday, Eaton found nothing but to remind her that the wall had broken yesterday. But that wasn't what Doris had meant. She wanted to know if something had happened to Austin yesterday because of alcohol or something else. And Eaton reminded her a little of what she'd been like when she got home. Bit by bit, the blurry pictures in Doris's mind became clearer. Her eyes grew larger, as did her sense of shame. "Ah, no, I've been such a burden," Doris thought in horror. I guess your plan failed based on your reaction," Eaton summarized, looking at the girl shocked at the memory. "If it hadn't been for you," Doris blurted out, but immediately cooled down and continued. "I mean, if you had been kind enough not to bother us, Austin wouldn't have left." Ethan gave a skeptical look. He objected indignantly. If he had feelings for you, he wouldn't have left. Eaton couldn't understand why she kept talking to him formally and not formally. He asked Doris to either drop the formalities or not. Doris continued her self-digging. "But I didn't ask him to stay for ramen with those intentions, did I? That's not the point, is it?" she asked hopefully. "I told him that because I thought it would be nice to have dinner together," Doris began to justify herself again. "Even if that's what you think, Austin probably got it wrong," Eaton quipped, tossing the coffee cup away. Then added, "It doesn't sound like you had anything, so why did you say that? You're both hopeless." "Hopeless?" interjected Doris angrily. Checking the class schedule on her phone, Eaton checked to see if she had an introductory economics class today. Receiving an affirmative answer, he said he would have that course too. "Geez, how long were you in freshman year?" Doris thought aloud. But Eaton, not paying attention, informed her that he was pretty sure Austin would be taking it too. "Wow, Austin is enjoying his youth," Doris exclaimed admiringly. Ethan said skeptically, "See if you can apologize and clear up a misunderstanding or something." "Aha!" the girl replied enthusiastically. "Thank you, Jones, I owe you one," she threw out, running away, purposely calling him by his last name in retaliation for the fact that he was forever addressing non-you, or just, "Hey." "Thanks, Jones," Eaton said indignantly. "Hey, freeze!" Eaton caught up and grabbed Doris by the collar of her sweater. "I swear to God, you!" he growled angrily, but Doris interrupted him with a laugh. "I was just kidding. It's just that you kept addressing me as you." "I'm sorry, Eaton Jones," Doris apologized teasingly. Eaton asked her to stop, but Doris wanted to tease him. "If you don't like it that way, then how is Jones Appa?" As they chatted, they didn't immediately notice Austin entering the auditorium. Austin smilingly greeted Eaton. The guys also said hello to him. "Eh? Hi, Doris." He turned to the girl. "Oh, this is awkward," she began. But Austin squinted his eyes and eyed the guys suspiciously. "Hey, you two made friends while I was gone? Even joking around with each other?" Austin continued to look at them questioningly. As if on cue, Doris and Eaton simultaneously said emphatically no, but as if not hearing the answer to his question, Austin continued, sitting down next to Eaton. "Must be cool. Eaton is so hard to make friends with. God, is he stupid?" I could see it in Eaton's eyes. Eaton really wasn't known for being friendly, so he immediately told Austin that there was room for his backpack next to him, and advised him to sit somewhere else in a rude tone. "You're always so cold," Austin said frustratedly, as he walked out from behind his desk. Doris didn't understand how he dared to talk to Austin like that. Seeing Doris's disappointed look, Ethan said that if Austin wanted to sit next to him, he could sit across from him. "Opposite?" Austin clarified. "Next to Doris?" Austin mumbled awkwardly, shuffling over to the desk. Eaton nodded affirmatively and sighed, mentally wishing Doris luck, smiling sarcastically. Doris felt like he was mocking her on purpose. Austin continued to stomp from place to place, and Doris was hesitant to open her mouth and say the right words. At that moment, the girls approached Austin, calling him to sit where their group had gathered. Doris and Eaton watched in surprise as the girls asked him to tell them about the welcome party, and he was about to leave after them. Suddenly, Doris called out to him, "Wait, Austin!" How hard it was for her to make this simple appeal. "I wanted to tell you something," Doris blurted out, and she was met with surprised and questioning looks from Austin and the girls who were so eager to lead him away. Before Austin could even answer, one of the girls, a pretty brunette with a bob haircut, intervened. What do you want to say? Huh? Who's that? Doris didn't realize what was going on. Ah, that's right. I have something to say to you too. The brunette spoke again. Doris was confused. What a coincidence that we met like this, the girl continued. Catherine Audley? Doris stammered as she recognized the girl. It's been a long time, Doris. How have you been? She asked with a smirk, taking Austin under her arm.